This video contains spoilers for Elden Ring, Gravity Rush 2, Death Stranding, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and Sable. From the moment you wake up in a tiny chapel wedged atop a steep plateau at dusk, Elden Ring primes you to want more from its world. Outside the chapel, it's hard to see much of anything for all the fog, but if you pan the camera outward, you can catch a hazy glimpse of an enormous fortress. Minutes ago, the game's opening cinematic implored you to rise, to venture through that fog and seek out lost grace. But you're trapped on this plateau, and you want nothing more than to escape it so you can explore the lands between, a world you're told rightfully belongs to you. I mean, the place is called the Chapel of Anticipation. Then, a mass of limbs and blades grants you your wish and you wake up in a cave. It's dark, and the cramped tunnels around you completely obscure the wondrous world around you. So you cut down anyone in your path, whether it's a shambling corpse or a human soldier, to see it again. Eventually, the tunnels give way to signs of human ingenuity. You step on a switch, and a lift carries you to the foyer, and the last iron door standing between you and that world. You heave the door open as every bone in your body begs for the warmth of sunlight and the freedom of an open field, and you hit that moment. The first breathtaking view of a world you're going to explore for countless hours. Any open field would have inspired awe, but Limgrave isn't just any open field. Its sky is a somber quilt of yellow and black. An enormous spectral tree, bigger than any object you've ever seen, pierces that sky. The sunken edges of abandoned buildings, dilapidated churches, and crumbling bridges slice the horizon. Every path you see begs you to explore it, teases some prize, even as it threatens danger. The hills to your left have tucked away a valley, daring you to abandon sunlight for another trek into darkness. To your right, a slew of hills and trees give way to a floodplain too open to be empty. And in front of the church ahead of you lies a stoic, golden knight and their radiant horse, who will cut you down for taking the path of least resistance. Despite all the danger, though, you're brimming with purpose. You may have come from a faraway place, but you have a claim to this land. Venture into these lands, plunder their depths, climb to their heights. If you can tame this new world, it belongs to you. That's the promise of every open world game like Elden Ring. And more than just about any game before it, Elden Ring keeps its word. It is in many ways the epitome of the open world game as we know it. A fantasy journey that invites you to scour its every corner, overcome its fearsome enemies, and collect its enchanting riches. But it's also a familiar fantasy, one that contrasts its incredible views with pernicious and imperial pleasures that evoke a history of violence and genocide. And the more I see impossible vistas like this, the more I venture out into enormous, beautiful worlds with my sights set on their domination, the more I wonder if the only way to explore a world is to conquer it. Growing up, I learned about how brave explorers discovered America. I learned how, escaping the persecution of the Dutch, a group of English pilgrims braved the waters of the Atlantic and arrived at Plymouth Rock, taking in the gorgeous shorelines, verdant greens, and rocky cliffs surrounding their landing spot before deciding to, make something out of the whole continent. So they set up humble settlements all along the eastern shores of North America. They explored and discovered unfettered plots of wilderness throughout New England and transformed them into towns like Plymouth, Boston, and Salem. They fearlessly blazed trails westward, plopped down more markers of civilization in their wake, plowed the roads connecting them all, and created a network of trade and commerce that would lay the foundation for the British colonies that would, after a little scuffle with the English, found the United States of America, the most free nation on earth. I feel like my entire life since grade school has been about peeling back the layers of those lies. Like how the Pilgrims actually landed at Provincetown weeks before they ever reached Plymouth Rock. Or how, by the time the first waves of Anglo-Saxons who really preceded the Pilgrims arrived in North America, it had already been discovered and explored by Vikings, the Spanish, the French, and the Chinese. Or how, America didn't need to be discovered. Before settlers arrived in North or Central America and began colonizing it, Indigenous groups had already built up civilizations that spanned most of the continent. They had already domesticated animals and established complex farming processes for corn, beans, and squash. They'd built irrigation systems and roads, they were trading jewelry and playing elaborate games with balls made from tree rubber. They were going to war with each other. They had governments with constitutions and customs. The Pilgrims and all the other settlers before them didn't discover anything. They conquered it. My American history classes pitched the founding of the United States as the result of a war between the tyrannical British Empire and the scrappy American settlers who just wanted a voice in their government. But in his book, The First Way of War, John Grenier states that when it came to securing the future of America's independence during its early years, the conquest of the West was not guaranteed by defeating the British Army in battle in 1815, but by defeating and driving the Indians from their homelands. By the Revolutionary War, American settlers had already been skirmishing with indigenous groups allied with the British and French for years. But after the war, the new nation fully dedicated itself to eradicating anyone who would dare question its rightful ownership of territories it had already claimed ownership of. As Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz writes in her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, Anglo-Saxon settlers frequently raided and destroyed indigenous settlements, stole everything of value from them, and later claimed they were the ones who were attacked. They created bounty systems in which men would claim the literal heads, and later the scalps, since human heads were a bit of a pain to carry around, of indigenous people for money. They wrote land treaties to cheat indigenous people out of land and valuable resources, then betrayed their own word and outright killed the native populations anyway. Every American conquest and acquisition meant the loss of territory and resources and lives by indigenous peoples. And as the conquerors spread through the continent and destroyed anything that opposed their right to rule, they spun tales of killing and destruction into stories of exploration and discovery. They told themselves it had to happen for the good of everyone. And, after they'd successfully conquered the continent from sea to shining sea, they sat content in the knowledge that not only were they lords of all they purveyed, but that this was their destiny. They were the masters of their own fantastical new world. The promise of an open world game is that the world belongs to you. You can load it up and go anywhere, do anything, anytime. Except they don't actually work that way. Their worlds might be big and there might be lots of optional activities to do, but a lot of open world games treat their worlds as conduits for objective markers. You always know what your next destination is, and areas are regularly locked behind story progress. These games are so deeply afraid of you missing one of their hidden objects or activities that they directly point them out to you. They eschew real exploration in favor of more structured and linear journeys that just happen to take place inside extremely wide hallways. You can do some of the activities in whatever order you want, but playing an open world game usually feels like going to Disneyland with a tour guide at your side the whole time. Elden Ring doesn't feel like that. It breaks a lot of the rules open world games have established over the years. It silently invites you to walk whatever path catches your eye at any given moment. If you want to finish the game, you need to kill 5 specific bosses, head to a particular area, then kill a few more bosses. And the game doesn't hide that, but how and when you get around to that is up to you. Elden Ring tucks all but the most important loot, dungeons, bosses, and stories into every obscure corner of its map. Which means you're either going to have to explore for hours to find them, look them up in a guide, or, well, just miss them completely. Elden Ring is fine with that. That hands-off approach has earned Elden Ring a rarefied status among open-world games, with only The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and possibly The Outer Wilds as its only real competition when it comes to how it encourages curiosity and self-direction. When so many games take for granted whether players want to be guided directly to the most exciting parts of their worlds, that Elden Ring has the confidence to let players wander around aimlessly has made it the epitome of the open world genre. But for as many rules as it breaks, Elden Ring still abides by a lot of the base tenets of the open world genre. The most important one being that what you're doing in Elden Ring isn't exploration, it's conquest. From Software games teach players to approach the world around them with caution. Even basic enemies can surprise you from dimly lit corners, gang up on you, and kill you before you can react. Whether you're rounding the tight corners of a dark, ruined castle or wading in waist-high mud through stupid fucking Blighttown, you should always be on your guard, because you just never... Elden Ring is actually a little more lenient here because it wants you to explore every corner of its world, but it's still a From Software game. Outside a few areas like the Round Table Hold, you need to be wary of the world around you, or you'll probably fall for a surprise attack, get duped by a character into dying, accidentally commit a terrible crime, or run face first into a god damn it. Elden Ring conditions you to see the Lands Between as a series of traps and encounters with enemies, a world where you should distrust everyone you meet until they make their intentions clear. You can talk to a handful of characters and do tasks for them, but otherwise the only meaningful way to interact with something is to attack it or take it. Because of that, the moment you set out from that first cave, you're not exploring the Lands Between, you're conquering it. The first cutscene in Elden Ring tells you that you are a Tarnished, one of a group of people exiled from the Lands Between who have returned to the continent to regain their lost grace by reforging the Elden Ring. There's a lot of factionalism, betrayal, sad sacks, and other emotional drivers in the world, and there's a story behind why you do what you do. But as far as you're concerned, your goal is to kill enough important people to become the Elden Lord, the most important person in the Lands Between. Only one of the game's 6 endings benefits anyone other than yourself, and it's the ending that requires you to complete the most involved and obscure questline. In 4 other endings, including the one you get by default, your ascent to Elden Lord says very little about your intentions, other than you're aligned with another deity or powerful figure, and all of them doom the land to a deathborn fog, a rotten disease, or your own chaotic reign as the Lord of Frenzied Flame. Every ending has this tragic ring to it, as if now that you've become Elden Lord, you've gotten yours, and what you do with the Lands Between doesn't really matter. You became ruler because it was your divine right, and anyone who stood in your way, fuck them. How you intend to rule doesn't matter as much as the fact that you are the ruler. You could easily argue that you're meant to be the bad guy in Elden Ring, that the game frames your campaign of murder and conquest as evil. That moral ambivalence actually makes Elden Ring an outlier in the open world genre. Most open world games are more like Breath of the Wild, where your journey to stop Calamity Ganon and rid the land of its presence is framed as an unambiguously good and selfless deed, one that doesn't leave Link in charge of Hyrule after he saves the world. In Elden Ring, you feel accomplished about having beaten the final boss, but you may not feel like a hero when you do. Either way, it's not the explicit storytelling of Elden Ring or the parts told through item descriptions and cutscenes that's earning the game all of its praise. It's the story of each player's foray into the world, choosing which path they want to go down after they exit that first cave. I think if you asked most people playing Elden Ring what they were doing, they'd say they're trying to find the Elden Ring and become Elden Lord, and that they're just wandering around killing things until they do that. They would probably say they're the hero of the story, but wouldn't be able to say much beyond that. This is the story that tells us that to explore means conquering, or as Amitav Ghosh describes colonialism in his book The Nutmeg's Curse, subjugating and reducing to muteness an entire universe of beings that was once thought of as having agency, powers of communication, and the ability to make meaning. Few of Elden Ring's fantastical locations are there just to be seen. That incredible first field in Limgrave is a joy to take in, sure, but anyone who's played a video game before is also scanning its vistas for the hard-to-miss glow of items in the distance. In games, worlds usually exist as places to extract things from, whether that's experience, items, crafting resources, or whatever. You might come to a game for the sights, but the most important function of a video game world is as a bottomless pool of things to acquire. In Elden Ring, the world is only as interesting as the last cool weapon, bit of lore, or surprise enemy you find. If any large section of Elden Ring's map offered only some great views without a single item, enemy, or boss fight, it would be remembered as the most skippable area in the game. That's because the only meaningful ways to interact with the world are to kill something or take it. There might be reams of text buried in item descriptions that tell you about the history and people of the Lands Between, and they might make that world feel more lived in and real. But you don't see that world as you wander around. To you, the player, the Lands Between isn't a world like the ones we imagine in other kinds of fiction, where people live and interact with each other. To you, the Lands Between is a playground for violence and conquest. It's a world designed to be conquered, and you'd never want to live here. There's no meaningful way to do that. Instead, the most meaningful interaction you have with Elden Ring might be with its map, a staple of open world games that's new to From Software games. In most From Software games, you are playing to find the next bonfire. They either cap off a level or act as safe zones on your journey. They fully heal and resupply you, and usually you can teleport among them. They are the biggest markers of progress. Once you've gotten to a save point at the end of a particularly difficult gauntlet of enemies, you've more or less conquered that area. You may not have found all of its secrets, but you can breathe a little easier as you explore, since dying won't set you back much. Elden Ring has a map that tracks all of its bonfires, called Sites of Grace, and it changes how you view your journey. In other From Software games, I might wander around the world long enough to build a mental map in my head and outlevel every enemy, but the lack of a map means these locations always feel at least a little unknowable and mysterious. Not knowing where I might go next keeps me squarely focused on what's ahead of me and highlights how, for as ambitious as the aspirations of my character might be, I'm really just scraping by, trying to get to my next goal and then move on. I can't see where I've been, take pride in the slew of icons I've checked off a to-do list, or plot out the next part of my journey by looking at which parts of the map are still hazy. I still bask in the triumph of beating a boss or unlocking a new shortcut, but in these worlds I'm a passerby, bumbling my way into places I don't belong and surviving by the grace of the nearest bonfire. When I played Elden Ring, I could clearly see how my presence and control of the lands between expanded through markers that laid out all the progress I had made by killing and looting. I could very clearly chart my journey through the game by which sites of grace I'd found. As I killed enemies, looted items, and wrested control of each region from the boss that controlled it, all the sites of grace along the way were a measure of my control. More than in other open world games, I felt like an invading one-man army, braving into an unknown land to fight the locals into submission, conquering the land to become its lord. I'm not the first person to bring up this kind of thing. For years, people much smarter than me have brought up the implicit colonial and imperial fantasies at the heart of all kinds of games. How much this colonial fantasy rubs up against issues of race and power in incredibly messy ways, and how focusing on these kinds of fantasies limits the games themselves. Meghna Jayanth, a video game writer who's worked on 80 Days, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Sunless Sea, has written a lot about how games love to satisfy players using imperial systems, and how violence and conquest tend to go hand in hand.
It's no coincidence that most mainstream video games present the world to the player at the barrel of a gun, and that killing and war are fundamental mechanics and themes. The gun is still the fundamental tool that we give players to interact with the world. War and conquest as pleasurable ways of being in the world are fantasies of empire.
I also don't think Elden Ring would be better if you somehow got rid of all the combat, or if you took away the map, or somehow figured out a way to divorce its violence and exploration from the colonialist fantasy that defines it or any other number of open world games. I like killing all kinds of stuff in games. I like pillaging loot from corpses. I get as much satisfaction out of establishing my dominance over a world as anyone, because I like overcoming challenges in video games, and establishing dominance over a territory by killing things is the challenge of open world games. I love Elden Ring. This essay isn't some argument that Elden Ring is bad, actually. But when I think about the potential of the worlds modern video games make possible, I think about how games built on the promise of exploring those worlds squander their potential. The biggest difference between open world games and non-open world games is that you have a bigger playground. Games seem to be built around the question of what kind of world can be built with these systems, and not what kind of systems can be built in this world. Places as breathtaking and rich as the lands between are begging for more ways to engage with them, ones that actually feel like they're inspired by their worlds, that capture the feeling of being in a big, wonderful place without feeding the compulsive desire to subjugate and destroy it. And the thing is, there are other visions for how we could engage with giant video game worlds, games that make honest-to-goodness fun out of just wandering around them instead of conquering them. They're just not as common or popular. They're often divisive, frequently buried inside games that hint at that vision, but also succumb to the need to indulge violence and power, or are held back by what's expected out of them. But they are out there, and they could guide us to more enriching worlds, ones that you can actually live in without sucking the life out of them. Gravity Rush 2 came out in 2017, and even back then, it felt a little bit behind the times. Instead of opting for the hyper-realism, dense foliage, and vibrant ecosystems of modern open-world games, its cities are gorgeous but simple, suspended in the sky by magical crystals and littered with precious gems you use to buy ability upgrades. It's that kind of open-world game, more concerned with being a fun playground than a believable world. Gravity Rush 2 also feels bound by the strictures of what an open-world game should have been back then. You often need to fight things, and combat is pretty simple. Your best attack is the one that lets you shift the gravity of nearby objects and just chuck them at enemies. You unlock multiple combat styles, but they don't really add all that much. There's a whole mining aspect that I never touched because it's just not fun. The best side missions were the ones where you flew around the city to replicate a photo someone gave you, but they were tied to an online system that's gone now. Most of the side activities are either time trials or races without much context, or short stories in which you run errands for people. You deliver their newspapers, fetch their dogs, ferry their supplies, play private eye for them. Even in the main story missions, there are too many stealth sections where you need to tail someone, where if you move too far out of the bounds of the mission, you have to start over. And you're compelled to do all these things because they're the easiest way to power up and get more precious gems. It's all especially frustrating because in so many of these side activities, you're not even doing the thing that makes Gravity Rush 2 so special. The main hook of Gravity Rush 2 is not technically flying. You're technically manipulating the gravity around you so you're falling all over the world. But as far as I'm concerned, it's flying. And it's the most freeing form of movement I've ever experienced in an open world game. If you want to get to a roof because you see a precious gem on top of it, you don't have to solve a puzzle or talk to the right person so they'll give you a key or look around the environment for the right series of ledges to climb. You just point where you want to go, and you fly there. In a game about traversing giant swaths of space, it feels like cheating. But that doesn't give Gravity Rush 2 nearly enough credit. Its cities are designed like playgrounds, and here that means building them around the fact that you can fly. And because of that, Gravity Rush 2 feels like one of the few games that actually gets you to think about its world as a three-dimensional space. This is where its old-school open-world design actually elevates it. Precious gems are littered all over the districts of Jirga-Patalau and Hexaville, the game's two cities. You have to literally fly under the world to even see some of them. They're in tunnels that no human has probably been able to access in years because they're tucked away in some obscure alley and you're the only person who can fly into them. In any other game, looking for each and every one of these gems would feel like a chore, but because it's so easy to fly around, exploring every corner of these island cities is the most gratifying part of the entire game. It turns these giant cities into one of those 3D sliding ball puzzles, except you're doing it with an absolutely jaw-dropping, nondescript version of Sao Paulo, London, or Malibu. More than in most open-world games, it's easy to admire the grand scale of these cities. They feel lifelike and impossible at the same time. There will be a merchant selling bread down the street from a hairstylist and a butcher, and then just a few feet away, the town just ends. Anyone walking by could just fall off the face of the earth here. But that doesn't matter to you, because you can just fly. And it's not just the thronging markets, city streets, and resorts. The other most appealing part of Gravity Rush 2 is not flying, but just falling. You gain such an appreciation of how meticulously built and large these spaces are, because you can just fly around them and admire them from any angle. But what I appreciate most about Gravity Rush 2 now, more than I did in 2017, is how it refuses to give in to the power fantasy that fuels so many other open world games. Kat, the character you play as, is a down-on-her-luck magical girl who, for the first couple hours of the game, has lost her ability to fly after being flown away from her home in Hexaville by a violent storm. She lands in the Banga settlement, a hodgepodge collection of ramshackle buildings strung together in the sky by rickety wooden bridges. The settlement is run by miners of ore that comes from ethereal floating islands. You run errands for Lisa, the stoic leader of these miners, who takes you in and feeds you based on how much ore you can mine. You're not empowered, you're not the chosen one yet, and even after you do get your powers back and start liberating Jirga-Patalau from its fascist oppressors, Kat is only a small but powerful part of the group of comrades who save the city and start the slow process of democratizing it. It's astonishing how thoroughly Gravity Rush 2 avoids feeding the compulsive desire for control other open world games thrive on. Kat is compelled to use her powers to help people, but gets increasingly frustrated by the fact that the townspeople don't even like or respect her. They dupe her into doing their grunt work, and she has to hide her powers because if people knew, they'd freak out or want to exploit these powers, and she's pretty regularly proven right. Her frustrations about not being able to unleash her potential, about being bound by a class hierarchy in society despite how powerful she is, are supposed to be your frustrations. The side activities may not be fun a lot of the time, but they tell stories about exploitation and class consciousness. Most side quests end with Kat being screwed out of whatever reward she was initially promised. The cities these stories are set in themselves tell the same story. The richer districts of Jirga Paralau literally float above the people at the bottom, where they can forget about the livelihoods of the disaffected. The trash they throw over and the problems they ignore fall on the poor, stoking the fires of the societal overthrow that comes halfway through the story. Gravity Rush 2's story and its setting keep the game laser focused on the idea that power, whether it's physical or political, shouldn't be exploited to control and subjugate people without it, even if they're kind of annoying sometimes. Gravity Rush 2's open world fantasy has little to do with conquering its world. Gravity Rush 2's open world fantasy is about finding a home within its world, the thrill of taking it all in and flying around it, about defending it from those who would want to control or exploit it. Its floating cities don't rely on complex ecological systems, and its citizens don't keep individual schedules, but Hexaville and Jirga Paralau are just crowded and bustling and wondrous enough to feel like real places, ones not built with imperial pleasures in mind. Its playground may be simplistic and frivolous compared to modern open world games, but you could imagine living inside it. And the fantasy of living in this world is made so much better because, well, you can fly. You also never feel like you're taking over any part of the world. You're not motivated to clear out or reclaim sections of the city. For as powerful as Kat is, her role in the conflicts that arise for most of the game is as a problem solver. She rarely asserts her power over others or acts of her own accord unless it's to defend someone in need. In fact, she could probably learn a lesson about standing up for herself. The only thing you ever extract from the world are precious gems, a resource that is rare in this world, but it's implied in cutscenes that Kat is sharing any wealth she gains. And because she uses her powers mostly to help other people, it doesn't feel exploitative to take these gems and power up a bit. In 2017, the rule for open world games said you needed various activities to give players some amount of power and control over the world they explored. You couldn't just come up with a good hook and then create a world to let them loose in. Gravity Rush 2 has a tremendous hook, the kind of wondrous movement that genuinely stokes the imagination. I wish it had the courage to realize that just flying around a space, taking in its sights and reveling in the feeling of falling, was enough. But Gravity Rush 2 gives you all those various activities, does transform into a playground, all without ever implying that your success within it gives you ownership of it. Gravity Rush 2 wants you to empathize with its people without lording your power over them. For as much control as you have over how you explore and discover every nook and cranny of these floating cities, it never crosses your mind that you're destined to be their lord. Like Gravity Rush 2, Death Stranding wants you to explore some of the most beautiful, otherworldly places you've ever seen. Unlike Gravity Rush 2, Death Stranding has you doing what it does best almost all the time, whether you're hiking up harsh terrain or hiding from monsters. It imagines the world as a series of challenges without assuming that overcoming those challenges makes you the master of its world. The goal of Death Stranding is to climb up impossible places. The sharp edges of its rock formations, the perilous contours of its mountains, the constant pressure of rain that decays anything it touches. These things all send the message that you should fear Mother Nature as much as admire it. Walking up an incline means planning your route through stones that do not welcome your footfalls. The game's larger mountains require flexible plans of attack. Braving blizzards to reach your next destination gets you to question why you ever made the trek in the first place. Climbing a mountain in Death Stranding actually feels like climbing a mountain. But the sights at the top of those mountains, they're why you make that climb. I felt more accomplished getting to the top of a hill in Death Stranding than I do beating the final boss in a lot of games, because running and climbing feel better in Death Stranding than shooting does in most shooters. You're carrying enormous loads of goods that could tip over and break apart, so you have to constantly think about how your body is balanced. There's a genuine fear that comes when you're walking down a steep hill. You have to feather the triggers on your controller to slow down your descent to avoid falling over. Even later on, when you get access to climbing gear and vehicles that make it easier to move across the flatter parts of the world, you have to think carefully about where and when to use these objects, because they're not always useful, and they're usually limited. So for the 50 or so hours I spent with it, Death Stranding refused to let me take its world for granted. Some quick context. In Death Stranding, you play as Sam Porter Bridges, one of a newfound class of post-apocalyptic delivery people called porters who carry packages across the US, which is now known as the United Cities of America, or the UCA. This is because the arrival of mysterious entities known as beach things, or BTs, has destroyed basically all of the terrain and population of the country and turned them into hills and holes, and destroyed most of the convenient ways people have of accessing each other, including roads and the internet. So your role as Sam, a delivery person literally running around the country delivering packages, is a pretty important one, and gives you an excuse to do a lot of running and climbing. But the way that running and climbing is gamified in Death Stranding makes it pretty different from other open world games. Good traversal in most games is simple, fast, convenient. It's why grappling hooks, speed boosts, and fast travel are so common, because they let you get around more quickly to whatever else the game considers the fun parts. The act of getting somewhere is usually only as fun as how quickly you can get it over with. One of the more common and potent power fantasies of open world games is how they let us shorten or get rid of our commutes. But for a genre that prides itself on letting you explore enormous locations however you want, it's strange that a lot of open world games treat movement as a means to an end. The worlds in open world games are often just a series of convenient commutes to their most interesting locations. And it shows how these games are mostly interested in creating the illusion of choice by letting you choose what parts of the map to expand your presence into next, and make it as quick and easy as possible to conquer a map by checking off all of its icons. Death Stranding doesn't entirely escape that structure. It's full of those kinds of open world markers. A lot of your journey as Sam has to do with expanding the chiral network, a kind of post-apocalyptic internet, by traveling to and reactivating posts all over the UCA. Once you connect them, these outposts do act as fast travel points and mark your progress and control over a particular region. You also get access to user-created bridges, towers, zip lines, and other items that make travel in that region much easier. But no matter how many upgrades you have, your first journey into new lands, whether that's a volcanic bog, a treacherous mountain, or a city infested with monstrous BTs, is harsh. If you want to climb that mountain in the distance, it's going to take some real effort, but the game primes you to want to do it. The journey, not the destination, is the reason to play Death Stranding. Most of the outposts don't actually have anything in them. You're not venturing into caves to plunder treasure. You aren't heading to each location to suck out all of its resources. Sam is here because he has a job to do, and you're here because you love to take in the world around you, however harsh it might be. Death Stranding is pretty good about not letting you forget that. I just wish you could imagine its incredibly, deeply beautiful world beyond the barrel of a gun. Sam isn't on a quest to conquer the country, or even save it at first. He wants to be left alone. He wants to deliver a package and interact with as few people as possible along the way. It isn't until the latter half of the game that he even accepts his role as the world's savior, but he never makes any claim to power. But Sam does wield a gun, something that changes his and our relationship to the world of Death Stranding. He has a gun because Sam isn't the only person out there who delivers packages. There are people called mules out there, and they get such a thrill out of delivering things that they've resorted to stealing packages from other people so they can deliver them. Yeah, that's weird. You can fight off mules by punching them or swinging attaché cases at them, but the best way to fight them and other living enemies in Death Stranding is by shooting them. Like in most Kojima Productions games, there are non-lethal options, but the most effective of these just swap live ammo for non-lethal rounds, which might make shooting live humans a little more palatable, but doesn't really address the fact that your main mode of interaction with other people out in these harsh lands is to shoot or fight them. More than any other game by a major publisher I've played in the last few years, guns and combat are unnecessary and disappointing in Death Stranding. Like in Gravity Rush 2, just the act of moving around in Death Stranding's world is fun enough on its own. The game even has other ways to engage with the world that don't involve guns. The stealth sequences with BTs are just as thrilling as any combat scenario in most games. Shooting and combat are the least interesting parts of Death Stranding. It isn't that violence or shooting someone in Death Stranding feels out of place. It's that having the option to shoot at all primes you to interpret the world around you in a particular way. The inclusion of guns in a game that isn't primarily a shooter, no matter how it's contextualized, makes that world innately hostile. When you have a gun on you and it's the only way to interact with people as you roam around, every human being you see becomes a target. This is especially true when games take place in the wake of an apocalypse, because wiping out most of humanity, turns out, makes it easier to justify the kinds of selfish behavior most video games encourage, and happens to go hand in hand with colonialist attitudes. When resources are scarce, everyone else is at best a competitor, and at worst actively working against you. At their most cynical, video games that rely on this kind of setup fuel a kind of survivalist thinking, that the world and everybody in it is out to get you, and you should act only in your self-interest if you want to get by. The gun in your hand just makes that attitude lethal. And look, the world is harsh and will kill you if you let it. That's how a lot of people, especially people under the thumb of poverty and oppression, experience the world, and I can't deny that. It's hard not to look at the world today and see it as a constantly shifting battleground. But that view feels like it's the only side of the world open world games are interested in portraying, even when their themes, story, and mechanics hint at a more friendly or hopeful vision for the world. Last year, I went on a road trip. This was back when most countries took COVID way more seriously than they do now. Going outside felt like venturing into a frightening and desolate world. Most restaurants and public places were closed. There were shortages of essential supplies as people bought up whatever they could to prep for the worst and left store shelves empty. Every encounter with another human, when I found one, was tinged with a kind of tension, whether that was, is this person going to make me sick? Or is this person going to get into a fight with me about my mask? Or, because I was traveling on my own for 2 weeks, some version of, is this person going to put me in danger? In that atmosphere, it would have been easy for people to become detached and hostile towards each other. But the people I met were, on the whole, pretty friendly. I commiserated with hotel workers about the state of the world even as they dropped off a complimentary breakfast on the other side of a plastic glass window, then moved away so I could approach the counter to pick it up. I talked to gas station attendees who were afraid of losing their job in the pandemic, but still wanted me to know that I should try the new flavor of Reese's Cups. In the middle of a pandemic that left resources scarce and activated a dog-eat-dog reflex in mankind, it also triggered a powerful need for us to help each other survive. Traveling the world in that state was scary, but also kind of reassuring. I think it's important to employ a healthy amount of skepticism about the world, but it can't be the only way we see it. Video games are usually much more comfortable depicting death and conflict within the massive, breathtaking worlds they let us inhabit than anything else. And it creates a link between large spaces, violence, and conquest that I don't think makes them better. I think there's plenty of room for games that offer a more optimistic view, not only of how we can explore worlds without conquering them, but about how people might behave in them when push comes to shove. Death Stranding wants to be that game. Its big revelation at the end is that there's an unavoidable world-ending catastrophe on the way, an allegory for climate change Sam isn't in any way equipped to stop. This will happen. But rather than give in to cynicism and continuing to distance himself from other people like he has the entire game, Sam chooses hope.
In the game's climax, Sam must put down his gun to embrace Amelie, his sister. It's an argument against all of the gunfights he, and you, have fought up to this point, a gesture that reveals the game's ultimate point. That our ability to care for one another, not our dog-eat-dog reflex, is the only thing that can save us. Alone we have no future. I wanted to accept that. I believe in Death Stranding's message. But after hours of showing me the world through the barrels of various guns, it was hard to see how Death Stranding could truly believe in a world without them.
In Sable, the world is hard to navigate. Its canyons are full of crags and hoodoos without obvious inclines to guide your eye to a climbing path. Its blue salt flats repel unwelcome travelers, but also tempt them to look for meaning in whatever caves and geysers happen to be nearby. Like in the UCA, signs of civilization are scant, mostly desert towns with merchants and mechanics carving out a living by serving the few people around them. They're all tied together by a loose network of messengers, but all of the settlements you find feel isolated from one another. To live in the world of Sable means mostly to get by. And yet, Sable is a deeply optimistic and brave open world game. It's dedicated to a vision of its world, and by extension ours, that is divorced from violence, isolationism, and conquest. It made a lot of sense when I learned Meghna Jayanth, whose talk on white protagonism and imperialism in game design I quoted earlier, was a writer on Sable. In Sable, you don't play as a chosen one meant to save the world, or a temporarily embarrassed conqueror meant to rule and pilfer it. You, as Sable, are just a child trying to find her place in a much larger world. You start the game by preparing for a ceremony Sable's people practice, in which children of a certain age leave their families behind and explore the world to see if their true calling in life lies somewhere beyond their settlement. So you take a fixed-up hoverbike and explore the desert, hoping to get a certain number of masks that represent different jobs. For most of the game, you essentially shadow a bunch of people who found their place in the world, like some sort of vagabond intern. It sounds like something out of an art piece, but Sable's two major mechanics, riding around on your bike and being able to climb basically anywhere, are both really fun. It basically lifts the climbing mechanic from Breath of the Wild wholesale, and it's a pretty good version of it. Climbing up all these impressive locations lets you appreciate every cliff top you reach, because the longest climbs take some real effort. And riding your hover bike everywhere lets you appreciate the breadth of visuals here. And God, I mean, you're watching this video, you know how good this game looks. The developer, Shedworks, did such an amazing job of mapping the artistic sensibility of artists like Mobius to an interactive world that it boggles the mind. The way each location is visually distinct and can look different depending on the time of day, the way smoke billows out of your bike as you speed around canyon paths, and how even the most intimidating parts of the world are all in their way beautiful, makes Sable one of the most consistently captivating worlds I've ever been in. Sable isn't all that different from other open world games. You do tasks for people you might aspire to be someday, fetch things from around the world, track down thieves, figure out where a missing villager has gone to. You can find upgrade parts for your hoverbike. There are dozens of little guys that act as collectibles you return to their mother in exchange for more stamina. These are all pretty common video gamey things. What isn't all that common, and what makes Sable such a brave and defiant game, is what it doesn't have. There's no combat. At all. There are a few large, intimidating creatures roaming the various deserts, jungles, and salt flats, but none of them can hurt you. You can't die from falling off a cliff, so all you really stand to lose by trying to climb one is the time it will take you to do it. You do need money to buy things like bike parts, and even Sable acknowledges that every living thing needs to take something from the world around it to live. But it also understands that you can get what you need without taking what you don't, that you don't need to abide by the philosophy of every man for himself. The best way to earn cash is by finding and salvaging scrap metal, not by killing something or taking it from another body. That might sound like a minor thing, but that context does matter. Sable takes a lot of care to make sure the tenets and loops of its world don't fall prey to the open world genre's colonial tendencies. When you first arrive in a city or other important location, you can fast travel there like you can to a site of grace in Elden Ring, but since you don't have to defeat anything to get there, and because most of the places you can fast travel to are populated by other people, you haven't conquered these locations just by arriving at them. It's striking just how much this can change the tenor of a world. Sable's world isn't exactly friendly. There are difficult climbs to make, spaces where getting by is difficult. For all the pleasantness of its characters and towns, it's clear that precarity guides a lot of their thinking, but that never develops into a cynical, dog-eat-dog view of society. The citizens of this world aren't out to get you, and you're not out to get them. Everyone's just getting by and helping each other. That vibe changes the way you see and interact with the world. When you reach the top of a hoodoo, or a mountain, or finally reach the top of a lightning-battered plateau at dusk and get a look at the ridiculously cool monument in its center, you can't help but admire it, to just stand there and say, I can't believe this is here. You may dart your eyes around the screen to scan for climbing paths to reach the top, and there may be a little worm to rescue, but as a player, you never approach places with the expectation that they'll transform into battlegrounds. When you arrive at an ancient temple with a giant mechanism you need to figure out how to activate, you don't do it knowing there will be a weapon that will make you more powerful. The reward for venturing inside a giant spaceship is not much more than a few details about how it got there. And while that backstory is definitely one of the most interesting stories in the game, it doesn't radically change what your journey is about. My favorite moment in Sable is when I stumbled onto a tiny village nestled atop a series of canyons. Well, I didn't so much stumble onto it as I saw the incline created by the tail of a giant skeleton, climbed up that skeleton's back, and then used another giant skeleton as a bridge to finally stumble into a handful of buildings at the top. The only quest here, though, if you can call it that, has you talking with one of the residents, then checking in with the other one to see what they're up to, since despite being the only two people living here, they don't see each other that much. There's really nothing else here, no important item to reward your arduous climb, no boss battle to make the whole endeavor feel worth it. There's just two people hanging out, taking in the world for what it is, not what they want it to be. At the end of Sable, the world doesn't get saved. It might be a tough place to live at times, but it never needed saving. When you've finally decided to stop dabbling, you have to choose who you're going to be using whatever masks you've collected. You can be a machinist and serve others by choosing the machinist's mask, or maybe you'd rather just see what the world has to offer, and you choose the climber's mask. You can be an entertainer, a guy who's really into Beatles, or become the mysterious Shade if you happen to inherit the title from the previous shit. It's a long story. Or you can choose the mask you started the game with and be happy being a part of the family you came from. It's one of my favorite endings in a video game because it so clearly communicates what Sable has been about all along. That you can really be whoever you want. You're free to be what the world wants you to be, to succumb to the same pleasures and impulses as everyone else, to be the person the world around you has ingrained you to be. You're also free to cast off the burden of those expectations, something you learn by exploring, and I mean actually exploring, both your identity and the world around you. It may not be the most realistic vision of the world, it may be a little too naive to survive contact with the actual planet we live on, but I think it's worth imagining worlds that are entirely unlike our own, not just in the kinds of incredible sights they can offer, but in what those spaces mean to us, what they prime us to want from them. Sable primes you to want more from this world, but it doesn't want you to own it, or get something out of it, or see it as a place where you do whatever you can to justify the destruction and subjugation of the people around you. The reward for exploring the world of Sable is getting to see a fantastical, surreal vision of the world that's just there to be seen. Sometimes that's enough.